The luxury suites here are $2,500 a night, my daughter-in-law said, standing in the middle of that crowded hotel lobby in Aspen. They're for people who know how to enjoy life. Maybe you and Dad can ask to sleep in the room next door. I stood there, beside my wife, who had just recovered from surgery. Her hand was still cold from the snow blowing in through the revolving door. My son kept his head down, staring at his phone, as if we weren't even there. Our 45th wedding anniversary trip began just like that, with an invitation to sleep on someone else's kindness. If you're listening to this, and you believe a family should be built on respect, not money, then subscribe so you won't miss the next story. And leave a comment telling me what city you're listening from. I read every single one. Now, let me tell you what really happened after that moment. In that hotel lobby, I didn't answer right away. At 70 years old, I've learned something simple. When someone tries to push you into reacting, silence can be the strongest reply. But that silence that day wasn't calm. It was the only way I could keep my dignity from falling onto the cold marble floor of that hotel lobby. Outside the tall glass windows of the St. Regis Aspen Resort, snow was falling hard. The flakes swirled under golden lights. So beautiful they almost didn't look real. I had thought this trip would be gentle. Gary said it was our 45th anniversary gift. You and Mom deserve to enjoy yourselves, he told me on the phone. I believed him. Margaret believed him even more. She spent a whole week before the flight picking out a new coat, dark blue. After her minor surgery earlier that fall, she was still weak. I almost declined the invitation, but she said it had been a long time since we'd gone anywhere far with our son. When Amy handed room keys to her family, I noticed something wasn't right. Each envelope was presented with both hands and a bright smile. Mountain View Suite, private fireplace, marble-soaking tub. Then it was our turn. No envelope appeared. Amy looked at me, then at Margaret. The way someone checks an item that doesn't belong on the list. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. And then she said it, about the luxury rooms and sleeping next door. A few people near the front desk turned to look. I heard the small scrape of a rolling suitcase. Someone cleared their throat. Gary kept his head down. His finger moved slowly across his phone screen, as if reading something important. I looked at my son longer than I should have. 35 years old, a real estate broker, well-dressed, confident with clients. But in front of his wife, he often chose silence. I've told myself many times that his marriage is his business, but in that moment, his silence wasn't private anymore. Margaret squeezed my hand. Her fingers felt colder than usual. "Stephen," she whispered, "maybe there's a mistake." I knew there wasn't. Amy stepped closer to the counter. She lowered her voice, just enough for us to hear. Aspen is very busy this time of year. Good rooms have to be booked months in advance. I did my best. I didn't ask how she had done her best. I didn't ask why an all-inclusive invitation ended with two elderly parents standing there without a key. I asked only one question, softly. "So, where is our room?" Amy tilted her head. "If you'd like, I can call a small inn down in town, more affordable. Or," she glanced toward the staff hallway, the room next door. The Miller family stood behind her, watching everything, dressed sharply, talking loudly about their new yacht in Florida and business connections in New York. When my eyes met theirs, none of them held the look for more than a second. I realized I was standing inside a painting I hadn't been invited into. Margaret coughed lightly. Not from a cold. It's the kind of cough she has when she's anxious. I placed my hand on her back, feeling the thick fabric of her coat, still not enough to warm the air around us. "I think we'll manage on our own," I said. Amy shrugged. "Up to you." Short. No apology, no embarrassment. We pulled our suitcases away from the desk. The revolving door opened, cold wind rushing in. Behind us, I heard a hotel staff member call Amy's name, wishing her a pleasant stay. Outside, snow covered the steps in white. The resort shuttle driver was helping another guest. I didn't ask for assistance. I've worked in places where people judge you within the first few seconds. Today, I knew I had been judged, and quietly removed from the list. Margaret looked at me. There were no tears in her eyes, just one silent question. What do we do now? I've lived through more winters than my son has. I've stood in boardrooms where men tried to make me feel small, to gain an advantage. I understand that tactic. Create pressure, cause embarrassment, force someone to beg. But I'm not 20 or 40 anymore. I don't need to prove myself in a crowded hotel lobby. I took out my phone. My contact list isn't long. I'm not the kind of man who keeps many social connections. But there are certain numbers that never get deleted. Margaret watched as I searched for a name. She didn't ask. Before I pressed call, I turned to look at the building behind us. Warm golden light spilling through the glass. Somewhere inside, my son was probably already in that Mountain View suite, maybe telling himself everything would blow over. My anger isn't loud. Not the way young people show it. Mine settles quietly, like thick ice beneath a frozen lake. I raised the phone to my ear. The call connected after 2 rings, and I began speaking in German. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then a deep male voice answered in precise German. No small talk, not a single unnecessary word. I kept it short, 2 sentences. No long explanation, just my name, the timing, and one specific request. When I finished, the man replied, "Of course, sir. 15 minutes." I ended the call. Margaret looked at me. Her eyes softened, but she still looked tired. The snow was falling harder now, dusting her hair white. I pulled her collar up gently and guided her toward the covered waiting area. "Stephen," she said quietly, "you don't have to make this into something bigger." I knew what she meant. She has always been the peacemaker. But this wasn't a small misunderstanding between family members. It was intentional. And I wasn't going to let my wife learn how to endure one more humiliation. The cold wind moved across the plaza in front of the St. Regis Aspen Resort. I noticed Margaret breathing a little faster than usual. Her hand trembled slightly in mine. "Are you all right?" I asked. She nodded, but her face had gone pale. The long flight from Seattle, the altitude in Aspen, and the shock from earlier. Her body couldn't handle it all at once. I helped her sit on a wooden bench near the wall. Snow settled on our shoulders. Inside that warm building behind us there were fireplaces, mulled wine, Mountain View suites. Outside, my wife and I sat like 2 misplaced guests. The glass doors opened again. Amy stepped out wearing a thick fur coat. She didn't approach right away, just stood a few yards away. "You're still here?" she asked. Her tone softer than before, but still edged with judgment. "If you need, I can call an Uber." "I won't," I said. Margaret placed a hand lightly on her chest. I could feel her heartbeat through her coat. Not dangerous, but strained. Amy frowned. "Please don't pretend to be sick just to take my sister's room. It's her birthday. I don't want anyone ruining it." I heard that clearly. I've heard careless words before. Many of them. But when a young woman looks at the woman who has stood beside me for 45 years and calls her exhaustion pretending, something inside me grows very still. Not explosive, not loud, just still. "We don't need anyone's room," I said evenly, "and we don't need anyone's permission." Amy shrugged again. "Suit yourself." She went back inside. The glass doors closed behind her. I leaned closer to Margaret. "We won't be staying here tonight." She looked at me, surprised. Then, where I didn't answer, 12 minutes later, a black Bentley rolled slowly into the arrival area. Not the resort shuttle. This one stopped directly in front of the steps where we were sitting. A man in a long coat stepped out and walked straight toward me. "Mr. Stephen," he said in English, "this time everything is ready." Margaret turned to look at me. I stood and helped her up. The man opened the car door. Warm leather seats inside. The temperature perfectly adjusted. As the car pulled away from the street, Regis Aspen Resort, I saw the hotel lobby growing smaller in the rearview mirror. There's something I never told Gary and Amy. Years ago, when I worked in the aviation industry, I participated in a small investment deal. Small enough that I never mentioned it at family dinners. But over time, it stopped being small. I don't own the entire resort. I don't need to. I hold just enough to ensure my voice is heard when necessary. And I rarely use it. The car climbed higher, turning onto a private road, snow thick on both sides, the noise of downtown Aspen fading behind us. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked, softly. "Just a little higher," I replied. 10 minutes later, we stopped in front of a secluded lodge, warm light spilling from wide windows. Quiet, no crowds. The man opened the door. All amenities have been prepared. A local physician has been notified in case assistance is needed. I nodded. Inside, it was peaceful, a fireplace burning gently. On the table, hot tea, not wine, a small detail, but it meant someone had listened. Margaret sat down on the sofa and breathed deeper. Color slowly returned to her face. You knew, she asked. I simply didn't forget who I am, I answered. I said nothing more. I stepped out onto the small balcony behind the lodge. Snow still falling, but from this height, everything looked different. Aspen shimmered below like a map of light. I took out my phone. A short message was waiting. Executive board has been informed. The incident in the main lobby has been documented. I didn't ask for anyone to be reprimanded. I didn't need public apologies. But I wanted one thing made clear: no one has the right to make my wife feel like she must ask to sleep anywhere. I went back inside. Margaret was watching the fire. I don't want this to ruin everything, she said. Neither do I replied. But some things, if left unspoken, will repeat themselves. Down at the main restaurant of the resort, the Miller family was preparing for their Christmas dinner. I knew that. I also knew Gary was using the credit card I quietly deposit into every month for his family fund. Maybe tonight, people would understand a little better where certain comforts come from. I'm not trying to embarrass anyone. I simply want to put things back where they belong. And sometimes, to do that, a man has to step out of a Bentley in the middle of a snowstorm, not to show off, but to remind everyone that silence has never meant weakness. Evening falls quickly in Aspen. From the balcony of the lodge, I watched the lights in the downtown area grow brighter as the sky turned a deep shade of blue. Down there, inside the main restaurant at the street, Regis Aspen Resort, the Miller family's Christmas party was already underway. I knew they had submitted their guest list in advance, an event to showcase business connections, to take photographs, to prove they belonged. Margaret had rested for nearly an hour. The color in her face had returned. The on-call physician checked in by phone. I answered briefly and said everything was under control. I didn't want to turn her health into a spectacle. I just wanted her warm and respected. Are you really going down there? She asked as I put on my coat. I think we should wish everyone a Merry Christmas, I replied. She looked at me for a long moment. 45 years of marriage is enough for a woman to know when her husband has made up his mind. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't revenge. I simply didn't want tonight's story told in a version where we were two elderly people unable to care for ourselves. The Bentley drove us back down toward the center of town. The snow still fell, but lighter now. When the car stopped in front of the restaurant entrance at the Street Regis Aspen Resort, I could see through the glass black suits, evening gowns, wine glasses catching the glow of chandeliers. The restaurant manager was already waiting outside. He opened Margaret's door first and gave a slight bow. Not dramatic, just proper. We walked in. The music paused for a brief second, just long enough for me to notice how many heads had turned toward the entrance. Not because I stood out, but because the manager walked just behind us and whispered something to the staff. In the center of the room, Amy stood beside her father, raising a glass for a toast. Her voice was clear, confident. I caught words like family, success, future. Gary stood next to her, smiling at the right moments. Then Amy saw us. Her smile didn't disappear. It simply slowed like a mechanism, struggling to adjust. Gary followed her gaze, and I watched the color shift in his face. We didn't approach their table directly. I guided Margaret to an empty table near the window where we could see the snow falling outside. A server brought her hot tea without being asked. A few minutes later, the man I had spoken to in German that afternoon entered the dining room. He wasn't in a service uniform. He wore a dark suit and a simple tie. A member of the resort's executive board. He walked straight to Amy's table. I couldn't hear every word, but I saw the change on her face as he spoke. Her father stood to shake his hand with a wide smile. Perhaps he assumed it was an honor. Then the man's voice carried clearly enough for nearby tables to hear. I've been informed that 2 senior guests were not accommodated according to standard protocol this afternoon. The air in the room tightened. Amy glanced around and gave a light laugh. There must have been a small misunderstanding. We take our guest experience very seriously, he continued. If there was any sign of disrespect, especially toward a long-term shareholder of the group, we are obligated to review all related partnership agreements. I didn't look at Amy then. I looked at Gary. My son was trying to remain composed, but he understood that this was not casual language. Amy's father blinked. "Long-term shareholder?" he repeated. The executive didn't answer directly. He turned and looked toward our table. Several heads followed his gaze. I stood up, unhurried. I adjusted Margaret's collar gently, and we walked toward the center of the room. I didn't speak as we passed the Miller family's table. I stopped in front of Gary and Amy. "Merry Christmas," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in that unusual silence, it carried. Amy forced her smile. "You found somewhere to stay?" "Yes," I replied, "a little higher up." Gary opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. The executive stepped forward. "Mr. Stephen is one of the strategic shareholders who supported the group during its expansion into the Colorado market. We value his perspective highly. No further explanation was necessary." Whispers began to ripple through the room. The Miller family no longer stood quite as tall. Amy's father looked at her differently now, not with pride, but calculation. Amy looked at me. For the first time that evening, I saw real uncertainty in her eyes. "Why? Didn't you ever say anything?" she asked. "I didn't think I needed to," I answered. "I didn't list assets. I didn't mention percentages. I didn't emphasize power." I turned to Gary. "How did you think your mother and I got here?" He swallowed. "Dad, I never asked you to be proud of me," I continued. "But I will not accept you pretending not to see your own parents standing in a hotel lobby. No shouting. No long lecture. Just the truth, placed gently on the table between wine glasses and crystal light." The music had not resumed. The servers stood still, waiting. I turned to the executive. "I'm not asking for anyone to be punished," I said. "I only want to ensure that every guest, regardless of age, is treated properly." He nodded. In that moment, the balance in the room shifted. But I knew the real change wasn't the atmosphere of the party. It was the way Gary would begin to look at the things he stood on: the house, the car, the cards in his wallet, and before the clock struck midnight. I intended to make sure my son understood exactly where all of it came from. No one returned to the party right away. The music stayed silent. Wine glasses were set down more slowly. I could feel it clearly, not because I wanted attention, but because when the truth is spoken, a room always needs a few seconds to adjust. Gary looked at me as if searching for a reasonable escape from the situation. Amy was different. Her back remained straight, but her hands tightened around her small silver clutch. "Why would you do this in front of everyone?" Gary asked quietly. "I didn't do anything," I replied. "You chose the setting." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The way my son avoided my eyes said enough. Amy's father stepped closer, keeping his tone controlled. "We're all adults. If there's a misunderstanding, we handle it privately. There's no need to bring up shares or contracts." "I agree," I said, "which is why I'll speak privately with my son. But before that, something needs to be clarified." I turned to Gary. "The house you're living in Bellevue," I said slowly, "was purchased through a trust fund in your name. The SUV Amy drives is under that same fund, and your monthly spending account is replenished from a source you've never asked much about." Gary went still. Amy looked at him. "Gary," I continued evenly, "I established that fund when you graduated from college. I never made it public because I wanted you to build your career without feeling bound by it. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist." The Miller family stood silent. "Are you threatening me?" Gary asked. "I'm not threatening anyone," I said. "I'm stating a fact. And the fact is, as of midnight tonight, that fund will be suspended." No one laughed. No one thought I was joking. Amy took a step back. "You can't do that over something minor at a front desk." "I'm not doing it because of the front desk," I said. "I'm doing it because of attitude." I looked directly at my son. "You stood there. You saw your mother. You heard what your wife said, and you chose to look down at your phone. Not every sentence needs volume to carry weight." Gary exhaled sharply. I didn't want to cause a scene. "Silence in the face of something wrong isn't avoiding a scene," I replied. "It's a choice." The restaurant manager subtly signaled for service to resume at other tables. The music returned softer than before. The party tried to regain its rhythm, though everyone knew something had shifted. Amy seemed to realize something else. "Gary's card," she said slowly, "is covering tonight's event." "Yes," I answered. She opened her clutch and pulled out the sleek metal card. "We pre-authorized $15,000 for this dinner." "I know." Gary stared at me. Dad, you wouldn't. I asked the bank to prepare, I said. Not to embarrass you, but so you understand that every dollar you spend has a source. Amy turned immediately to the staff member handling payments. She handed over the card, trying to remain composed. The machine made a short sound. The staff member tried again. The sound repeated, clearer this time. I'm very sorry, ma'am, the staff member said gently. The transaction has been declined. No one spoke loudly, but a few heads turned. Amy looked at Gary. Gary looked at me. Why now? Gary asked, his voice no longer steady. Because now you're understanding, I said. Amy's father stepped forward and took out his own card. I'll handle it. He paid, but the pride from earlier was gone. It was no longer a grand gesture, just damage control. Amy leaned toward Gary and whispered something. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the tension between them. Maybe it wasn't the first time. Just the first time it wasn't hidden behind chandeliers and wine. I'm not taking my son away from anything, I said calmly. I'm removing the dependence he's grown used to. Gary stared at the floor. Do you think your real estate contracts come that easily? I asked. Do you know why certain major clients trust you? Even when you had little experience, he didn't answer. I never asked them to favor you, I said. But my reputation walked one step ahead of you. And I never asked you to be grateful for that. I paused. But I do require you to respect your mother. Nothing more needed to be said. Margaret had stood beside me the entire time, silent. She didn't look at Amy. She didn't look at the Miller family. She looked only at her son. Gary, she said softly, I don't need a luxury suite. I just need you standing next to me. That sentence weighed more than everything I had said. Gary closed his eyes for a second. I checked my watch. A few minutes until midnight. After tonight, I said, the transfers will stop. The house and the car will be reviewed under the terms of the trust. You may keep them if you can prove you can stand on your own. Amy opened her mouth as if to argue, then fell silent. Perhaps she understood this conversation was no longer hers to control. I didn't demand an apology. I didn't ask anyone to bow their head. I simply turned to Margaret. Let's go home. When we stepped out of the restaurant, the snow had stopped. The air was cold, but clear. Behind us, the party continued. But I knew for Gary the night would not end with music. It would end with the question I had waited years for him to ask himself. If you take away your father's money, who are you? That night, we didn't talk much on the way back to the lodge. Aspen after midnight was quieter than I expected. Snow rested evenly on the rooftops. Yellow streetlights stretched across the road like a thin layer of mist. Margaret sat beside me, her hands resting on her lap, no longer trembling like they had that afternoon. Do you think you were too hard on him? She asked, as the car began climbing the hill. I kept my eyes on the road. If I were any softer, you'd continue being treated like an afterthought. She didn't answer right away. Then she sighed gently. I'm not hurt about the room. I'm hurt because Gary didn't step forward. I understood that better than anyone. The next morning, I woke early. On the kitchen table of the lodge sat a white envelope I had prepared before going down to the party. I hadn't been sure I would use it, but when I saw Gary standing in that hotel lobby with his head lowered, I knew the time would come. Around 10 o'clock, my phone vibrated. Gary. I looked at the screen for a few seconds, then answered. Dad, he said. His voice no longer carried last night's confidence. Can I come see you and Mom? Yes, I replied, alone. He arrived nearly an hour later. No, Amy. No familiar SUV. A rental car was parked outside the lodge. Gary walked in, removed his knit cap, and stood in the middle of the room like a visitor unsure where to sit. Margaret invited him to the sofa. She didn't scold him. She simply placed a cup of hot tea in front of him. I'm sorry, Gary said, staring at his hands. I didn't think things would go that far. Nothing goes far all at once, I said. It moves in small steps. He nodded. I didn't want to embarrass Amy, he added. Her family is trying to build connections with the resort. I didn't want to cause trouble. Respecting your parents is not causing trouble, I replied. The air in the room wasn't heavy like it had been the night before. It was quieter, more honest. I picked up the white envelope and placed it in front of him. He looked at me. What's this? Not money, I said. Gary opened it. Inside was a thin folder, a job application for a small machine shop outside Seattle. The same shop where I had worked after graduation. The owner now was the son of the man who hired me when I was 24. Gary looked up, surprised. You want me To work there, I want you to work somewhere your paycheck comes from your own hands, I said. Not because they recognize my name. He sat in silence for a long time. I have a business degree, he said quietly. I have an aerospace engineering degree, I replied, and I started in a machine shop. No one is exempt from starting over. Margaret rested her hand on our son's shoulder. I don't need you rich, she said softly. I need you steady. Gary stared out the window where snow still covered the mountainside. The trust? Is it really frozen? He asked. For now, I said. Until you can prove you don't need it to stand upright. He nodded slowly. No argument. No protest. When Gary left the lodge, he didn't hug me. But before stepping outside, he turned to his mother and said, I'm sorry I didn't stand next to you. Margaret smiled gently. I'll be waiting. After the door closed, the lodge grew quiet again. Do you think he'll change? Margaret asked. I don't know, I answered honestly. But at least now he has the chance. For the rest of our time in Aspen, we didn't attend another event. Instead, Margaret suggested visiting a community support center in town, a place that provided meals and warm clothing for seasonal workers. We spent 2 mornings there. Margaret folded sweaters. I organized boxes of food. No one there knew I was a shareholder of the resort. No one cared about what happened the night before. They simply said thank you when a coat fit properly. On our last afternoon before leaving Aspen, I stood once more on the balcony and looked down at the town. I thought about Amy's words, sleep next door. I don't know what she thought after we left that night. I only know that by the next morning her SUV had been returned to the dealership. The bank confirmed the trust was suspended as requested. I didn't feel satisfaction, only a sense that things had returned to their proper place. On the way to the airport, Margaret leaned back in her seat. I still want to come back here, she said. For what? I asked. To go skiing, she smiled softly. Just the 2 of us this time. I looked at her, then at the snow-covered road ahead. Money can reserve a room at the top of a mountain, but it cannot buy the peace of watching your wife sleep soundly after a long day. When the plane lifted off from Colorado, I didn't think about the party or the Miller family's expressions. I thought about the white envelope, and I hoped that one day when Gary signs a contract for a house he paid for himself, he will remember that snowy night in Aspen not as humiliation, but as the moment he began to grow up. Because a luxury suite is not the warmest place. The warmest place is when a man can stand beside his parents not because of money, but because of responsibility. If my story made you pause for a moment, take a little time to subscribe, like, and share this video. Somewhere out there, a father, a mother, or a son may need to hear this. Money can create distance very quickly, but respect is what keeps a family together. Don't wait until everything freezes over to realize the value of standing up for one another. Thank you for listening all the way through. I hope you always have the strength to protect what's right and the warmth to keep your family close.